Good morning. Before we get started today, I just want to mention that there is a new sign-up sheet for snacks, and our next Bible class is 3 weeks from now. That is one where if we don't think ahead, it can sneak up on us and we end up with no snacks that day. I don't think we'd want that to happen, so if you would please consider signing up to bring snacks on September 15th. I won't pass the sheet around, but it'll be right over on this front table here in case you would sign up for that. Thank you for considering.
Well, good morning. Welcome to the last session. I think also, usually there's, did they hand those out? Are there like response sheets or something like, there's surveys or something like that? I think they usually do that at the last. I've been a member here now almost just over a year, so I think I've got the routine down. So did they hand those out or not? Yes. Okay. I guess you'll leave them on the table and someone will pick them up. So, all right, let's begin with prayer. Lord God, Heavenly Father, we thank you that through baptism you have made us your children, and that you have made us people who have been called to declare the praises of you who have called us out of darkness into the wonderful light of faith in Jesus. Bless us as we again consider ways that we honor you and worship you and keep our focus on your word and sacraments in our weekly gatherings around the means of grace. Bless our time together in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we are having a little bit of technical difficulty with I don't have a clicker. The clicker isn't working. So we're going to have our guy on the space bar over there, Isaac. So I may point to him every once in a while. What we're going to do is, well, first of all, I'm going to again have my public service announcement. Maybe you saw it in the bulletin too. If you want to hit the button there. On this new book, Christ Through Us, The Pictorial History of Wells, 175 years. I'm one of the authors. Again, I don't get royalties, but I think you'd find it a good, interesting book. If you want to click to the next, just a couple sample pages. This is like the first 2 pages of chapter 1. There are even going to be color pictures and everything on it. And if you want to click one more, as well as various pictures of churches and people, and some of them very old. Some of those pictures date back to the 1850s and 60s. So maybe you'd find that interesting. I don't know. I hope you do. Where we are today, we're going to wrap up. We didn't quite get through all of art and architecture, so we're going to finish that today. That'll probably take maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then the last lesson is shorter. As you might know, it's only 1 page, and I have a very skeleton kind of outline. It's going to be sort of a potpourri of different things, especially as we talk about the actions of worship. So we're going to finish up art and architecture right now. I left things off last time. We're on the part that talks about the Lutheran principles of worship in art and architecture. And we had talked about how as the confession of our synod changed to a more Lutheran focus, so did the architecture and the use of art. And so by the time you get to the early 20th century, you really start to see churches that are expressing that. For example, Grace downtown Milwaukee was one of the last churches I showed. You know, that beautiful use of art, if you've ever been there before. If you want to click one more, that rose window and the balcony that kind of wraps around, brings people closer together. This is from, like, I think a picture of Easter in the 1940s, which I think is just a neat. Often you always see the pictures often are looking toward the chancel. I like pictures that are sometimes fun that show all the people, especially when you can see the hats and everything what people are wearing. Very typical 1940s kind of thing. The next question on next point on your outline, I just want to kind of walk through some architecture as we move through maybe the next these kind of last 100 years or so. Just seeing how do we see the principles of Lutheran worship. You remember the principles of Lutheran worship again? Let the gospel predominate, right? That's number 1. Let the people participate. So how does art and architecture allow the people to participate better? Let the experience of the church be honored. And finally, let all of God's gifts be used in worship. And maybe that's where we especially see that taking place. So I'm just going to show different pictures. This is St. Paul's Saginaw. some of you may have, anybody been there before? My dad was pastor there for about 20-some years, the last 22 years or so of his ministry. Beautiful church building built in the early 1920s. Great example. There's a lot of churches that are similar to St. Paul's in a couple of things. If you want to click the next, this is a picture taken from last year's Synod Convention, so that's why nice full church. What they've done with keeping this church up. But what you notice the good use of art, beautiful stained glass windows. Not only on the sides, but also behind the altar. You have a very prominent altar. You have, again, the very prominent pulpit. The baptismal font, you can see over to the left, it's a little off to the side. However, you notice it's substantial. It's artistic in its own way. And kind of a neat thing about St. Paul's, too, it's a rather wide church. When you talk about letting the people participate, how are we getting the people kind of closer to the action? It's also got interesting, the pews are curved, and it's got just a slight, there's a slight incline. I mean, so from the back of the church to the front, there's just enough. You can kind of notice, so that if you're parents and your child drops a ball, it may be rolling for a little while. But good acoustics as well. Now, of course, we'd want to talk about St. John's. St. John's constructed, I believe, was it working now?
No, but you can still use the laser, like when you were describing things.
Okay, if I want to
yeah.
point things out,
Yeah.
which is that? That's the little,
It's this one, rectangle.
right here.
Yeah, yeah.
Is
It's like
that-
when you were talking before
Okay.
about the,
Is it showing up there? Oh,
Yeah,
there we go,
yeah.
there we go. All right, St. John's, of course. Built in 1928, I think, right? 29. Same year that the seminary was dedicated, actually. Got it in before the Depression hit. Because something you'll notice, very few church buildings constructed between 1930 and about 1945. There are just not many, because first, no money. Second, war with supplies and so forth made it difficult. You find very few churches in that time frame built in the Wisconsin Synod. Interesting things about St. John's that I find interesting anyway. First of all, from an exterior, it communicates. What does it communicate to the community? Grandeur. Yeah. That this is God's house, and we are trying to honor God with this house. It makes a statement in the community. You can see it. You can't mistake it. It's a church, right? It's not, you can't wonder, oh, is this, maybe it's an auditorium, maybe it's a real estate office. No. This is a church. It's very clearly that. From the interior, this is an older picture that I think I scanned from a book. So there's a few things there that you might notice different from what we have today. Anything that you notice different that has changed? What?
No hymn boards.
No, we don't have the hymn boards anymore, right? Yeah, those have gone away a while back. Instead, we got the screens there. And service folders are more common. I think back in the day, people did, if they printed a service folder, it maybe listed the hymns and the lessons, but that was kind of it. And some announcements. A lot of times, though, a lot of churches didn't even print that stuff. Everything was on the hymn board. Anything else that you notice different? Are the lights different? Yeah, I think the lights are different. Yeah. Oh, Lynn.
The font.
The baptismal font, yeah. Lynn wanted to be sure to point that out. You notice where the baptismal font is on here. It's back in here. That was constructed kind of a baptistry just for the just for baptisms. I think one of the reasons for that is often baptisms were performed outside of the worship service. Usually after the service, I think, was often a time when those were performed. Whereas now we've gotten more often they're in the service, which I think it's a positive personally, that the congregation gets to be reminded of their baptism, gets to participate and so forth. I don't think there are the crosses on the side walls. I don't think those are there that are there now. But if you look at a picture that's that's more up to date here, that was shared with me. Again, you get I think different light fixtures, but the baptismal font has been moved, so it's down here now. We have the the processional cross that is typically there. The Paschal candle that's next to the baptismal font. Anybody know what's the significance, or what's the symbolism and everything of the Paschal candle, or what's the usage of it? Anybody know? Has that been explained, or when's the last time that was explained in here at St. John's?
We haven't always had it.
Okay, right. But it's we haven't always had it here, but it's a very ancient. It's got ancient history, like 1,300 years of history in the church.
We light it during the Easter season.
We light it during the Easter season. Paschal, the connection with Jesus' resurrection. But there are two other times when it gets lit, and it's why it's by the baptismal font. It gets lit for baptisms and funerals. Do you understand the connection? Well, I think funerals is an easy connection, maybe. Jesus, if we light it during Easter, it makes sense that we light it during a funeral. Kind of drawing that connection between Jesus' victory over the grave, and we have that hope even as we are having a Christian funeral here. We know that the body that we lay in the ground will be raised on the last day. The baptism one, we are buried with Christ and raised with him. That connection between Easter and baptism, that language that you get in Scripture, especially Romans 6. You might think of the Catechism too, kind of quoted Romans 6 in the Catechism. So that Paschal candle, I think, has been a neat, something it's been in the church for a long time. I think it's new to Wells. Its usage is fairly recent in the last few decades, maybe, but I think that's just a very positive thing. It's just another way of communicating the connection between Easter and baptism, and then Easter baptism and a funeral. I just think that's kind of a neat thing. This would get to more maybe an action of worship as well. If you celebrate a vigil, an Easter vigil service, I don't think we have that here, but a couple of our Welsh churches around the Synod have these Easter vigils. So it's the night before Easter, and it's has a very long history. One of the opening procession involves the Paschal candle, so that the Paschal candle is lit, and then they light everybody else's candles, and there's a service of light at the beginning, so everybody has their candle, and there's a series of readings and a procession that takes the Paschal candle up to the front, and that kind of becomes the focus of worship then during the Easter service. Couple other I think one thing about St. John's, the use of art here, I love it. I love the stained glass windows. They're kind of unique, a little different than like say a St. Paul Saginaw had big stained glass windows that depicted usually events from the Bible. St. John's stained glass windows use symbolism. And so we have a lot of different symbols. For example, this one, we've got the tablets for the Ten Commandments. What else do we have up there? I'm not sure what those other two are. Oh, I think it's the burning bush. So there's connections with Moses. I want to hit the next one there. We've got the evangelists. Each have a symbol of each of the evangelists. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. You'll find those throughout the various pictures. I think this one might be another evangelist. And again, the Bible with the Word of God. A little closer up, the cross. Maybe go to the next one. Is that the baptism? No. Crown, the cross and crown. Lord's Supper. One more. There we go. These are the three that are in the baptistry, or that was the baptistry. And so the fact that you know it was that and designed for that is from the content of the windows. You have the open Bible, you have the Spirit in the baptismal font, and then you have Noah's Ark and the rainbow, which is an interesting symbol to include. God's promise and the connection that Peter makes in his letter with baptism and the flood, And Luther actually wrote a prayer that connected that whole the ark, that we are really, the ark is kind of is a symbol of the church. We are kept safe above the turbulence, but it's through the waters of baptism that we have been brought into that ark. So just all those different connections you see, and those are in those windows. I believe, I think it's the one on the right, was in memory of my great-grandmother, actually. My great-grandmother, she died, I think, in the early 40s. And then my great-grandfather, who was the pastor here, remarried and had another, I believe had another child, because that son is actually younger than my dad, even though he's like his step-uncle or something like that. But anyway, those couple of, that window I think on the right was in memory of my great-grandmother. And then of course, the glorious Ascension window, which I think is one of the just a beautiful window. The only problem is you only see it when you're leaving. You have to turn up and look. Oh, okay. I thought it was one of the neatest things this last year on Ascension service. I was sitting up in the singing in the choir, and I'm sitting underneath the Ascension window as we're singing on Ascension Sunday, and that is I think that's one of the most beautiful stained glass windows that's around. Just the art in that, and kind of appropriate that you would see that as you're leaving. We're leaving with the Lord's blessing. We're leaving with the confidence that He who left is going to return, and so we go out into the world with that confidence, with that assurance that He who said, He who left says, "I am with you always," and will return. There was a line in the hymn we just sang. One of the hymns we sang today kind of had that. I forget which hymn it was now. Oh, the first one, Alleluia, Sing to Jesus. The opening hymn today has kind of a connection with Ascension and that promise that He who left says, "I am with you always," and we have that promise. This last picture I think this is one Christy put together actually, that has the Ascension in the middle and all the symbols from all the windows around, which is kind of a neat picture. So good use of art at St. John's. And I think, when you think about the principles of Lutheran worship at how is that depicted at St. John's? I think you can see it in kind of various ways. Good acoustics that let the people participate well. We've got the organ and piano and good places for the musicians. So letting the music, all of God's gifts be used, especially with art. We've got paraments and stole. I didn't mention the paraments that we have. That's another use of art. That communicates things. It communicates through color. It communicates through symbols. And then the history of the church is honored in different ways as well. So please.
I have to share this with you. A number of years ago, St. John's participated indoors to Wauwatosa, which was visits to various sites here in Wauwatosa. And I was one of the volunteer guides. And one of the visitors said to me, a small group, "I'm surprised you have a crucifix." And I have to say, I was stopped for a minute, like I was not expecting that question. So I was thinking about it, and my response, if you look at the altar, you have the Lord's Supper. As you look up, there's the crucifix on the altar, and then as your eyes move upward, it's the empty cross. And of course, you turn around and it's the Ascension window. So I mean, it did stop me.
That's neat. That's a neat connection you made there. She said she was, if you didn't hear her, Open Doors Tosa, is that what it was? And she was a tour guide, and someone asked her why we have a crucifix on the altar. She was kind of taking it. And if you look at the Lord's Supper picture on the altar, then you move your eyes up to the crucifix, and you move your eyes up to the empty cross. You could look sideways because there's two crosses on the side, two in the chancel, and then turn around and you see the Ascension. And that is something that people have sometimes, there's been a little bit of misunderstanding, I think, with that, with the whole, the crucifix versus the empty cross. Some have made the argument, well, Protestants always have empty crosses because we believe in it, because we're about the resurrection. That is not very accurate. I think we want Christ on the cross too. because after all, that is the payment for our sin. And so, and you never saw, Luther never got rid of crucifixes, in fact, spoke favorably of them. And so I think you're kind of seeing a little bit more, there was a stretch where a lot of Wells churches even had just a cross, empty cross. And a lot of it seemed to be in the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, and 70s when art and architecture kind of took a little bit of a hit, in my opinion. Part of it was American art and architecture at that time wasn't as grand as, say, the 20s was, and prior to that. So I think, and I'll show some pictures where I think there's been some improvement. Please.
So are Luther seals on most of the windows? Because in the fall, we would take the kids over during Reformation and count how many Luther seals were on the windows.
Yeah, a lot of Luther seals. Okay, yeah. So a lot of different symbols that are there kind of tucked away in the windows, yeah. Just again, kind of neat, good teaching opportunities though, right? Very good teaching opportunities. I mentioned the 60s, 70s, not always the greatest time for art and architecture in our synod. This is Emmanuel Gibbon, Minnesota. I think it was built in the late 60s, and again, you can see the old church to the right and the new church to the left, and if you click one more and see the interior, it's nice, but it's not, it's very utilitarian, I'd say, and you see this kind of design, not much in the way of art, often longer and narrower at times, often a lot of carpeting, which always isn't good for acoustics. If you turn to the next one, this is the church I served in Minocqua, Trinity Lutheran in Minocqua. It was constructed in 1974. I mean, it's beautiful in its own way. Its interior was, at least when I was there as a pastor, screamed 70s. The carpeting was olive green. I do have to say I was impressed that they kept that the carpeting was still functioning it was the original from 1974. And that's a lot of winters and a lot of salt and stuff. And it was holding up pretty well. But just, there was kind of a wallpaper that had some orangish to it. It just was not aesthetically pleasing. The baptismal, if you go back yet to the previous one for a second, the baptismal font was a box, more or less, with a bowl in it. And the lid rotated. It was just... It wasn't very aesthetically pleasing. It did not have any symbolism at all. When I got there, most of the time it was tucked off in the corner. I brought it out at least and put it at least in the middle, so at least people saw it more often. But after I left, they did a wonderful renovation of it, and this is what it looks like now. You can see a very prominent baptismal font over here. Oh no, the baptismal font over here. The ambo over here, redid the altar. They also put, you can't see it on the side, that the old windows were just kind of this yellowish colored, that was all it was. Now they put in they have stained glass windows that depicts Christian symbolism, and so the better use of art that you see in that church as well, and also better lit. They improved the lighting.
It's beautiful the way the cross is set up.
Yeah. Yeah, they did a nice job of that too. Yeah, they just a lot of great improvements that they made. I left and we had raised the money. And then they went back and re-looked at the plans again because it wasn't quite enough money for the original plans. And actually what they ended up with was even better than we had come up with, so it was great. You also see, I think lately though, you've seen a lot of good churches or a lot of Wells churches that have been using and making a conscious effort to use better art and architecture. So, for example, I'm going to just kind of flip through a bunch. This is Our Savior's Our Redeemer in Madison, built in the early 90s. What I like, again, you have a prominent, the baptismal font is over here, the ambo here. I like the wood. You've got this cross right here, the Jerusalem cross hanging suspended over the altar. That's kind of become a more popular sort of thing to do. You got the organ and piano. The musicians have space, but it's kind of they're not like up on stage, but they're kind of in a supportive role. Next one. This is Trinity in Kiel. The pastor there is Brett Nauman, a son of St. John's. And this was built in the early 2000s. It's surrounded by cornfields, kind of, but it's kind of neat, though. You can see it from a ways away because of that steeple that they put on it. And if you look at the interior, it's wide, so the people are being brought together. It has some stained glass windows over here. I think I can get it. There we go. Over here, it's got the pulpit, the font, altar, nicely lit cross, place for the musicians over here. This is St. Paul's, or I'm not sorry, St. Paul, Zion in Columbus, Wisconsin. So they had an old church that was in the downtown area. They relocated. They took the windows from the old church and incorporated them into the new one. And they have this neat altar piece, the triptych they call it. That is becoming more popular with using, again, art on the altar, depicting different Bible stories or different biblical accounts. But just a great use of art. And again, you have altar and pulpit and font are very clearly communicated. This is Faith Lutheran in Antioch, Illinois. Again, this one neat because this little place right here, that's like a little chapel. So when they have a smaller evening prayer service or something with maybe you're only going to have like 50 or 60 people, they have a place for that separate because the interior is a really rather sizable church. Again, they have the triptych here. They have a crucifix suspended over the altar. They have stained glass windows. Again, you have font over here, prominent altar, and the pulpit there as well. And again, this wider than longer is kind of a trend, is again bringing the people, letting the people participate easier. You can see each other, you can hear each other better, good acoustics. Another similar example, St. Peter's in Fond du Lac. There's another church that relocated from downtown, and they are, again, kind of, you see that church from a long ways away because it just is a prominent, it communicates something. And the interior, again, also is kind of neat with the art. You've got a suspended crucifix, this neat art that they're on that back wall is just unique, and again, very beautiful chancel furnishings. There's an artist in the Wisconsin, retired pastor Nathan Pope from Racine, and his daughter have been doing a lot of the chancel furnishings in a number of our churches, including the Chapel of the Christ at MLC. But you're seeing this kind of trend, though, and this is looking at a different angle. Again, they used the stained glass windows, incorporated them from the old church. So it's kind of how can we honor the history, use the good art? We don't want to lose that. I love the wood, again, the woodworking. The pipe organ, it does have a pipe organ that the pipes are in the back. And again, places for the musicians and the choir, wider, again, kind of a wide feel to it. Next one. Just so you know, I'm not a Midwest bias. This is Grace in Glendale, Arizona. Again, wide, substantial. You can see the stained glass window up there. The font, it's kind of interesting. They have an altar, or they have the altar, they have a pulpit, they have a lectern, and then they have the baptismal font over here. So, but it's still up in front, it's still clearly visible, so on. Another one from outside the Midwest, this is Faith in Sharpsburg, Georgia, suburban Atlanta. And you look at that church, I mean, you kind of think, that's dropped out of Europe or something. But you know something? When you're in the Bible Belt like that, and when every other Baptist church looks like a pole barn building, and you build your church like that, you're going to stand out. You got a conversation starter now. People are going to notice that as they're driving by and say, "Oh, what's that?" And then when you go inside, again, you've got the crucifix here suspended over the altar, stained glass windows. I love the banners. The substantial baptismal font is right here, front and center. So just, again, you kind of have this kind of consistency you're seeing in a number of the new builds. This one was probably mid-2000, 2005, I think it was. And this was a mission. It was a mission started in 99. And since 1999, that church has gone from basically the pastor and his wife, and maybe a handful, to I think it's like 600 or 700 members now. It has been blessed with a lot of growth. Pastor John Schrader is a gifted guy too that helps when you have a go-getter pastor and everything. But they've been blessed with, and very intentionally Lutheran, intentionally confessional Lutheran. Oh, sure, please.
I've noticed everyone in the front, there's all these things you're putting out. Is St. John's the only one when you turn around and walk out that you get the wow?
You mean the window? Oh, I mean, so you're saying the big window, are we the only one that when you turn around and go out, you have the big wow? I would say we're not. Yeah, no, I mean, maybe more recent. I mean, a lot of these modern builds, you don't have it, because a lot of the modern builds they don't have a lot going. I mean, the old ones, Grace has the big rose window. So some of those churches have a big rose window. St. John Valite has a pretty prominent stained glass window in the back. So going out, we're not, St. John's isn't totally unique in that, no. We're not the only ones. Please.
I have heard over the years that the original intention was to build a large window in the front that was supposed to be Jesus the Good Shepherd, but they just ran out of money, so they decided to just do the one in the back.
Okay, that could be. She said we ran out of money to have a big window up in front. Jesus the Good Shepherd, which that isn't the first time that's happened in Wells history. I know Salem, when Salem built their church on 107th, if you ever look, you can kind of see there's supposed to be a round stained glass window in the front chancel area above the altar and everything. Never built because they didn't have the finances for it. I think they should have thought about doing it when they did a whole sanctuary redo maybe 10 years ago, and they again didn't have quite enough money to be able to pull it off. So those things happen sometimes. What else do we got here? Oh, please.
Are these churches funded by the Church Extension Fund, and they only get so much money, and they have to spread it around?
She's asking if some of these churches that I'm showing here are built by the Church Extension Fund and they have to be judicious with their funds. Some are, but I would say most of the ones we're looking at are not. Those are funded by the congregations themselves. Maybe the exception would be the one I just showed, Faith in Sharpsburg, because that was a mission. But for the most part, these are congregations that they're doing it themselves. And some of these are sizable, especially nowadays. You're building a big sanctuary like that, you're talking $10 million, $11 million, that kind of thing. Sure.
In some Missouri Synod churches that I've been in, there's a eternal light candle hanging up. Do Wells do that at all?
She's asking about eternal light candle that she says she's sometimes seen those at Missouri Synod churches. I know of a few Wells churches that have one. In fact, Salem does in Milwaukee. To be honest with you, that's actually a Catholic thing. If I understand if I remember my history right, that actually comes because it's another way of symbolizing that Christ's body and blood are still there even after we've stopped celebrating the Lord's Supper. They're the remnants of them are in the are in that little container in the altar, and that light is supposed to be another way of symbolizing that. Lutherans have adopted that. Some Lutherans have. I think it's kind of a thing that came up around in the 60s, 70s, a little bit more. Kind of adopted that as Jesus is the light of the world kind of thing, and the light never goes out because Jesus never, he's eternal. That picture is there, but its roots really go back to some Catholic theology that we wouldn't agree with. So a lot of, it's there in a few. It's there in a few Wells churches from time to time. You'll find it there. If I were, I wouldn't add it. if it were up to me. If I was at a church that had one, I'd try to do a little education and maybe think of a way to remove it. We talked about it at Salem because I was there when they were doing some of the renovation, and they kept it because it had been donated by a confirmation class from back in the 60s.
I always thought it was because that the Spirit was always in the church.
The Spirit was always in the church. Maybe, I don't know. The one I always heard was Jesus. I always go to the kind of Jesus is the light of the world kind of thing, and he's eternal. This is Chapel of the Christ. Anybody ever been there in MLC? the big beautiful chapel there that was constructed in 2000, I think it was 10 or 11. Again, a great example of Lutheran architecture, which is good for our College of Ministry. It's interesting, the baptismal font, some of these you'll see at the entrance more, but very prominent, even though it never gets used, really. But it is it's a reminder to those students and faculty of our baptism. Same with the seminary, actually. We have a baptismal font at the seminary that has constantly running water, but there's never baptisms there, but it's a constant reminder, especially that sound of the water, constant reminder of our baptism. So there's never really absolute silence in the chapel. Another picture there. There's the triptych that they have up in the front. From the previous one, you saw that it was closed. They close it during Lent, and you open it the rest of the season. This is St. Paul's Lake Mills, just built a few years ago. Again, prominent cross, prominent baptismal font and altar and ambo. Lots of space for musicians over here. Doesn't have the stained glass art and everything, but that cross with Christ on it is pretty beautiful. And again, wider church. This is Christ the Lord Brookfield, which was just dedicated, was last year, I believe it was. Eric Sipe, I think, is from that. What? Last October it was dedicated, yeah. I love the cross, again, suspended over the altar, the stained glass up there. Again, pulpit, altar, font. The means of grace, constantly there. Ways that the gospel is predominant, even in what we see. I could have thrown a picture up there, if I could have found one easily, of St. Matthew's Economowoc, another newer church that, again, kind of similar. It's wider than it is long, but very prompt, bringing the people closer together. But the chancel furniture, a lot of wood, a lot of stone, those sorts of things are being used. And just so you show, out in the mission fields, I wish Pastor Schwartz was here today. This is the church at his mission, or in Florida before he left. This is the new church building that they constructed. If you'll click the next slide. Again, sometimes simple is okay, but still, what do you see? You still see altar, pulpit, font. You see cross. It communicates some things. Yes?
Newer churches, it incorporates like daylight, and I don't know, is there some symbolism to that, like the heavens declare the glory of God and nature?
I think it's from an aesthetic point of view, just cheerfulness. I think. That's one of the challenges, like with St. John's, when you have the stained glass kind of stained glass windows we have. I love the dark wood, but it does make it difficult for bringing in natural light. You just can't as much. Which is why you can offset that in your fellowship space, your gathering space. You can bring in that. But a lot of the more modern builds are trying to do that, bring in more natural light. And that's kind of those decisions you have to make. Okay, if we do that, then we maybe can't have quite the same stained glass windows and things like that. Please, in the back.
You've used the term amble a lot, and I don't know what that is.
Amble is just a new old term for pulpit. Same thing. I don't know why they started. Professor Tiefel started using that term, and that's what he called the one at our chapel at SEM. And so then sorry if I get into that. It's the same as the pulpit. The piece of chancel furniture that symbolizes the Word. So you got the Word, the altar symbolizes the Lord's Supper, and of course the baptismal font. So having that means of grace prominent, that's where the focus is, plus, again, a cross or a picture of Christ or something like that adds to that. How are we visually communicating the predominance of the gospel and the means of grace? And that's something that is distinctive when it comes to, say, when you're thinking about these principles of Lutheran worship versus some churches that you'll see, a lot of evangelical type churches. What do you see? It's more of a stage where the musicians are up there, and maybe there's the pastor's there. He'll preach from up there, but maybe he's got a little music stand or something that he uses to keep his notes on. And maybe there's an altar there, but if it is, it's maybe shoved off to the side and brought out only when it's needed. Good luck finding a baptismal font anywhere. especially if it's an evangelical church because they practice immersion, so they have to go and get their swimming pool somewhere else. Our theology communicates something. Please.
I was just kidding. That one looks like it was built by the church extension fund. That's about the way they look.
Yeah, it is true. This one probably was a little more fun. I'd have to ask Pastor Schwartz. But it's interesting, though, Pastor Schwartz mentioned the architect who did the Chapel of the Christ in New Ulm also designed this one. But he incorporated something, and again, you have a different budget, but still, for that congregation, it's a place that still communicates Lutheran theology in the way it's designed.
So when they built churches, you used to have maybe 6 or 7 steps for the pastor to get up to the pulpit, and that's really changed a lot too.
Yes, she said some churches used to have to, well, even at St. John's, you have to walk up a few. When I was pastor in Manitowoc, the pulpit was eye level with the balcony. It was glorious. Everybody's looking up at you. But you literally had to walk into the sacristy, up a little staircase, and then open a door. And the pastor that I succeeded told me what you always need to do before you enter, because the door frame was a little bit, if you didn't want to catch your forehead right here, you had to duck, which was probably a good thing to do in humility, bow before you go into the pulpit. But and that was not like when you're in there, you're not moving much. But it was, some of those, it was because of sight lines and things like that. If you have a lot of balcony, you kind of need something that's a little bit higher up. So like Grace downtown, Grace or St. John's Valete, their pulpits are a little bit higher for those same reasons. St. Mark's Watertown, because of the when you have more balcony, you need something that's a little higher up. Please, in the back.
Canopy that you see on altars, that was an old. You don't see that anymore. But that was to help get the voice out, right?
Yes. She asked about the canopy that you often saw on old pulpits, especially, was a sounding board. It was when you didn't have a good, didn't have microphones and such. That's what you had. So that kind of wraps up things for this art and architecture. Other things you might need to think about, especially in modern church builds, I think, are spaces for fellowship and gathering, which you did not have. When St. John's was first built, if I'm not mistaken, you pretty much walked in, you had a little hallway, and then maybe a place to hang the coats, and then you were in the church. When churches were neighborhood churches, you didn't need that gathering space as much because people saw each other during the week. But now, when congregations are gathering people from farther away, and this is maybe the only time you see people having a good fellowship space, that's a needed thing. And so a lot of these churches, even like a St. Paul's Lake Mills or St. Matthew's at Conomowoc, the gathering space area, the fellowship space entryway is like maybe half the size of the sanctuary, which is that's big. I mean, there's a lot of space. And of course, you have to consider accessibility issues. We need more and better bathrooms that are better located than you maybe did a generation or a couple generations ago. Just those things you got to think about, and sometimes building codes make you think about those things too. All right, I want to get to. You can actually just turn it off. The last lesson that we're going to cover in 15 minutes here, and I know it got pumped up in the bulletin, so now I feel bad. The sites, the actions of Lutheran worship, and this was just intended to be kind of a catch-all a little bit. When I was putting this course together, I just wanted to kind of catch a bunch of things. When you think about the Old Testament worship, there were a lot of different actions going on, weren't there? We're offering sacrifices. We're waving grain offerings. We're eating meals from fellowship meals. Sometimes there's processions. There's just a lot of different things going on. Even the priests. What are the priests all doing? They're going in. They're offering the incense. They're exchanging the bread one day, or that showbread, and lighting candles, and so just a lot of different there's a lot of different stuff going on in the Old Testament worship. New Testament, though, because we don't have the animal sacrifices, we don't have, a lot of that Old Testament worship that was assigned. Okay, what are things going to look like now? And different traditions have changed over the years. Different things have come around. I just kind of threw a bunch in there, actions of the presiding minister and actions of the congregation. From the presiding minister, one of the things I did put on there was vestments, because I really didn't cover that anywhere else. And I suppose that's an action. The pastor puts on something different. Now, why does the pastor wear what he wears? What do you think? Why does the pastor wear that white robe? Or back in the day, a black one? Humility, she said, I think that's one. It's not about the pastor. It's about the message he's proclaiming, so you're covering yourself, in a sense. It's not about the cool suit I've worn. There is tradition. Past ministers of the gospel, or presiding ministers in worship, I've been wearing vestments, I would say, since about the 300s, probably, 400s, where that has become very common. In the old house churches, it may not have been as much, but since when the church became, if you want to say, mainstream.
The colors of the vestments match the church year.
Sure. Colors of the stoles. Yeah, and the stole itself is kind of a long time symbol of the office of the public minister, the office of pastor. Back in the day, it would have been office of bishop or deacon. You had different ones. We don't have all those different grades of ministry, but we have the pastor. And so even in the rite of ordination, there is a rite that where the stole is put on him. Because vicars don't wear stoles. Seminary students don't wear stoles. It's not supposed to. Unless they don't know any better and they forget or whatever. But the pastor does. So it's a symbol of his office. And that's another reason I think to wear vestments, that the pastor is doing something that different that the congregation has called him to do. I think it also personally, I think it communicates dignity and decorum, that something different's going on here than everyday life. And so the pastor, the presiding minister, is wearing something different from everyday life. Because I wouldn't wear an alb, going shopping at Costco. I just wouldn't. So vestments I think are part. And I think that you communicate some things again with that. I think you communicate the dignity and what's something different's happening here with that we're celebrating Word and Sacrament. Processing, I have. Sometimes there's a cross, right? Does St. John's do a cross procession once in a while on high festivals? That's got a long history in the church, actually, having processions like that. Often it would be processing with actually the elements of the Lord's Supper. That goes back to the early centuries. There had been a procession of the gospel where they had an ornate book of the gospel. When it came time for the gospel, the assisting ministers would all get together. They'd have the cross. They'd move the cross. They'd move the candles, and they'd bring the reading of the gospel out among the people, because we're going to read God's word among the people. So that was a more ancient tradition. The way we communicate our reverence for the gospel now, the gospel reading is what do? We stand, and then we acclaim the gospel with that Alleluia as well. Sign of the cross, I think, is a big one. When does the pastor make the sign of the cross? If you think through the worship service real quick, when do you see the pastor make the sign of the cross?
Invocation of benediction.
Invocation of benediction. So beginning and end. We'll talk reasons why maybe at those two times. When else do you see him?
Baptism.
Okay, during baptism, and that's going to be a connection actually with the invocation. Because that sign of the cross on baptism, receive the sign of the cross on your head and your heart to mark you as a redeemed child of God. That's a long-standing tradition. It's not what makes baptism, but it's been a long-standing tradition, ritual connected to baptism, because what am I baptized into? The death of Christ. And now when we say the invocation, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, where were those words first spoken over me? at my baptism. And so pastor makes the sign of the cross, connecting that with baptism. What else?
Absolution.
Absolution, right. And again, when the pastor is saying those words, the word in the, I forgive you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, kind of that connection to absolution and baptism and Christ's death, all those connections are made in a visual way, in an action way. Often it's made at when the pastor is saying the words of institution. It's kind of it's a sort of a sign of consecration. We're setting aside these elements for this special purpose of the Lord's Supper. I think the pastors here, at least I do when I distribute Lord's Supper, when they dismiss a table, depart in peace, makes the sign of the cross. And I think that's where, because think of it when it's the blessing. When does the pastor make the sign of the cross? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord look on you with favor and give you peace. How do we have that peace? It's through Christ's death on the cross. So making that sign of the cross when you're talking about peace and bestowing that peace, whether it's that blessing of peace as you're departing from Lord's Supper, or that blessing of peace as you are leaving God's house after worship. So again, communicating that. Last one I have, blessing, the hands raised, when the pastor raises his hands in blessing. Jesus' ascension, right? When Jesus ascends into heaven, it says he raised his hand in blessing, blessed them, and was taken up. So as the pastor, Christ's representative, called minister of the gospel, is proclaiming the Lord's blessing on God's people. I think it's a nice symbol, a nice action that communicates that blessing with the hands raised like that. Any other questions about actions of the pastor? I mean, we could talk about, when does he face the altar? When does he face the people? Usually it's the altar to pray. Usually it's the people when he's that makes sense probably. Some STEM students get it. It takes a while for them to figure it out because they're doing liturgy for the first time.
Is that moving their altar out so that the pastor's behind the altar?
Yeah. She mentioned a lot of churches, especially more modern churches, have moved the altar out, a freestanding altar. That has become a more, I think, Luther actually talked about that. He thought that that's what the altar should, because especially he wanted it that way for the words of institution. That the words of institution serve a number of different functions. You're consecrating the elements, setting them aside, but you're also proclaiming the gospel to the people in the words of institution. So he wanted the pastors facing the people. And so having that freestanding altar kind of helps with that. And St. John's solution is having that table where the elements are on. Again, I think it's also probably a convenience thing that it's closer to where we distribute now. But I imagine that communion took a lot longer back in the day when you just had that small. Am I right? Did you go behind and then out the door, or did you?
Next group went up.
Okay, but you didn't go out through the sacristy or anything like that, did you?
They were standing. The second group would be standing behind the group that was.
Oh, okay.
And when they got up, they go straight down, and then
okay.
The other group.
It was that way. Okay. When I was in Manitowoc, I was told, and this is why I think sometimes churches only had communion a few times, like maybe less than 10 times a year. Sometimes they would distribute the bread on one side, and then everybody would walk behind the altar. They'd put their offering, there was always a communion offering, usually it was for the poor fund, and then they'd receive the wine on the other side. Can you imagine how long that would take if you have a congregation, if you have a church full of 600 people? I was told New Year's Eve and Maundy, Thursday services were very, very long back in the day, but that was back, of course, even further back when the men sat on one side and the women and children on the other. You had churches, that was a very common practice even in Wells for Wisconsin Synod for a while, yeah.
At our church during COVID time, we had little individual goblets, and also the bread was in wrapped and it was right in your seat, and so everybody got communion.
Yeah, some things you had to do during COVID with the little cup and the pop top. I'm glad we're back to normal, personally. I'm glad we're back to normal. Please.
When I was growing up in Watertown at Trinity, we had to go to the pastor's office to register for communion.
Sure. That practice of registering for communion with the pastor has, again, kind of even goes way back to private confession and absolution. Yeah, I was told that when I was at First German that there would be people lined up outside the parsonage office on like Friday, because whenever the hours were that he was available, there would be people lined up around the block to announce for communion. So that was a thing back then.
I went to St. Mark's Watertown, and our communion was every service, every Sunday, every Saturday, and then, but they did it privately, or you
They dismiss. St.
and
Mark's,
then you
yeah.
came back in, and they still do it that way.
Yeah, St. Mark's Watertown's kind of unique in that way. Yeah, that they offer Lord's Supper every service, every Sunday, but they have kind of a dismissal, and so not everybody stays. And that's their practice. That's been that way for a long time. Yeah, at St. Mark's. I kind of do too. Yeah, personally.
Growing up, we didn't eat before communion on Sunday.
Sure, lots of different practices like that. Well, Luther even says in the Catechism, she said they didn't eat. Fasting and other outward preparation may serve a good purpose, right? I'd like to get into quickly the one unique one at St. John's as far as actions of the people. I think standing, we understand. You usually stand to pray, stand to sing the canticles, stand for the Lord, for the gospel, sit for most other things. The kneeling, though, here at St. John's, I wanted to talk to Pastor Heinz, and I didn't have a chance to, because I was told that he might be the guy, because I guess it hasn't been around. Lynn would probably maybe be the best person to tell us. When did the kneelers come into St. John's? Do you know? Does somebody know? It was the 70s. That's what Pastor Schrader was telling me, and he said Pastor Heinz would know that.
I was here. There was the biggest flag over those kneelers that we were going Catholic because we had kneelers. And then they switched sometime later, this was in I want to say the late 80s maybe, to the white elves instead of then we were going liberal.
Yeah.
Because we were Geneva gowns anymore.
Sure.
So there were really people who were upset.
Yeah, things like that, traditions like that can be upsetting. She said the kneelers came in the 70s, and then they thought they were too Catholic, and then the Albs were doing that. I see Lynn, and I see maybe first to the left.
Anyway,
or Mary, yeah.
Well, I grew up I would think the reason you put the kneelers in is because you can't kneel when you go up to, you don't have a
Well, we
kneeler
would
there.
turn around and kneel facing, in the pew, so
Yeah, a lot
you
of-
would have to twist
And
around
that's,
and kneel
that's
that
what
way.
I grew up with.
And then, people get old and you can't do that. Like, let's get something a little bit more comfortable, so they brought in the kneelers. And then, of course, the same older people were saying, this is too Catholic, we can't have them.
But I could see that, because my church didn't have a railing up in front, so when you went back, everybody you kneeled right down to the floor.
Right, yeah, I remember my
Except my
mom
grandma,
kneeling
who
every
couldn't
time
do
she
it
came back
anymore.
from Lord's Supper when I was a little kid. My grandma, yeah. That was,
If you can kneel when you get your communion, then you don't have to kneel when you go back to the pew.
being a newer member at St. John's, I have to say I kind of like it. Kneeling once in a while, because we don't do it as often as they used to. A lot of places don't have the communion rails anymore. I think if your knees handle it, I guess, okay. Right, if they don't, you sit. But it communicates humility, doesn't it? That we are coming here humbly confessing our sins, or back in the day, humbly receiving the sacrament Jesus is giving us. Oh boy, I'm out of time. This is what happens. I'm sorry. I pray that this was beneficial. I enjoyed this. My last question is, summarize in one sentence why we do what we do in worship. Good luck, right? All to the glory of God. We want Christ in word and sacraments to be front and center, to be communicated clearly in all that in what we sing and say and do and decorate and build. And how can we do that? How can we best communicate and allow God's people to do that and to gather around word and sacraments? It has been a pleasure to teach you these last 6 weeks, and look forward to learning with you from who. I don't know who's the next topic, but do we know the next topic?
Lutheran Confessions.
Oh, well then, that'll be great. Who's teaching that one?
Paul Lineker.
Okay, that'd be fantastic. Pastor Langinger, Professor Langinger. All right. One quick question.
Not a question, just an announcement.
Okay.
It kind of fits in. In November, Pastor Mark Jeske will be speaking on history of Milwaukee Lutheran congregations, part 2. So if you missed his lecture this summer at Salem, he'll be repeating it. And it'll be in News and Notes.
Okay, watch News and Notes for Pastor Jeske talking about I was at that one, so it's a good presentation. My home church was even in there, North Trinity in Milwaukee. So